us what seemed like an unbelievable deal. A quiet little studio on top of a hill that we could rent for almost nothing. The catch was that we had to help maintain the 3 properties on the land and occasionally help our landlord with meals or drive him into town. Usually, if we took him out to eat, he treated us, so it honestly worked out pretty well. The studio itself needed a fair amount of work to be done before it was comfortable. We spent our first weeks doing renovations and fixing things up. Our studio sat at the top of a long driveway. Across the driveway, about 150 feet away, lived our only neighbor. Our landlord lived farther off to the right, about 3/4 of a football field away, and his girlfriend stayed in an apartment above his garage. The landlord was incredibly easygoing. We got free cable, water, and electricity. The only bill we had to worry about was propane for heat and hot water, which we had shared with the neighbors because both houses used the same large propane tank. We didn't officially meet the neighbor until a few weeks after we moved in. We introduced ourselves and chatted politely. A couple of weeks later, I ran into her again outside, and we talked for nearly an hour. Eventually, the conversation turned to the renovations we had been doing, and I invited her inside to show her the progress. Since it was a studio, stepping through the front door basically showed you the whole house. But the moment she walked in, she pointed at our bed and asked, "Is that a used mattress?" The question caught me completely off guard. I'm extremely particular about keeping my bed clean. I use waterproof mattress covers and keep everything spotless. The bright white edges of the mattress was visible from when I had made the bed earlier that morning. All I could say was, "No, I bought it brand new." After that awkward moment, we didn't see much of each other for a few weeks. Then one day, the landlord's girlfriend pulled me aside and told me something shocking. Apparently, our neighbor had been telling both her and the landlord that my boyfriend and I were known for burglarizing houses. I was stunned. Neither of us had criminal records, and neither of us had ever known anyone who committed burglaries. Supposedly, the neighbor claimed she knew because her daughter had recently become a police officer and worked at the jail. We all eventually dismissed the accusation, but the whole situation felt bizarre. Not long after that, I started noticing the dirty looks. Things got even stranger when I had to go collect her half of the propane bill. She handed me a check, and when I read her name aloud, something suddenly clicked in my memory. Years earlier, when I was about 16, I had gone to her house for Thanksgiving with my high school boyfriend. Her parents were friends with her and her husband, and their daughter was around our age. We all hung out while the adults drank and cooked dinner. I barely remembered interacting with adults, except during the dinner. But afterwards, my boyfriend told me that I wasn't welcome back to that house. We couldn't understand why. A couple of months later, I found out. I had hit puberty early and wasn't exactly flat-chested. My boyfriend's father apparently spent the evening staring at my chest, and the neighbor's husband had as well. Once the wives heard about it, they were furious. Somehow, I ended up being the one banned from their house. Now, more than a decade later, she clearly remembered who I was, and recently she had gone through a bitter divorce from that same husband. After that realization, the tension between us only grew. Every time I locked my car with the key fob and the horn chirped, she would immediately make her car horn honk too from inside her house. Then our landlord told us that she had asked that we stay completely off her property and never knock on her door again. Ironically, a few days later, she asked the landlord to request that we go inside her house while she was gone, to assemble a treadmill that she had bought, leaving her door unlocked for us. Things escalated further when a friend came to visit us one day. When he walked up our driveway, he looked confused. He told us the neighbor had taken a photo of his license plate and asked whether he planned to stay the night. Soon she started photographing our vehicles as well. She became extremely petty in monitoring whether we drove too fast up the driveway, yelling if she thought we crossed onto her side, and even threatening to sue us because one of our cats supposedly scratched her car. Around that time, one of my cats, an especially curious one, wandered into her house when she had left her door open. Not too long after, the cat disappeared. My boyfriend and I searched everywhere. A couple months later, we smelled something dead somewhere on the property, but we never found the source. The atmosphere on the property became tense for everyone, including the landlord and his girlfriend. One afternoon, I caught her sneaking around the side of our house while my boyfriend and I were talking outside. She was clearly eavesdropping. After that, I started hearing strange noises outside our windows at night. Then there was the mail. All 3 houses shared a single locked mailbox, and only the landlord had the key. Since he and his girlfriend didn't drive, the neighbor usually picked up the mail and dropped it off at his house for everyone. One day, I was expecting a state check in the mail, but it never showed up. Later, I also noticed I wasn't receiving other important items such as my driver's license, vehicle registration tags, and even social security paperwork. That's when I came up with a plan. I created an envelope that looked like an important piece of mail addressed to me and gave it directly to our mailman to place in the mailbox. Then I waited. Sure enough, when the neighbor brought the mail to the landlord's house, my envelope was missing. I reported the theft to the postmaster and even contacted the sheriff. But because mail theft is a federal issue and it was during the early recession, the case was never pursued. Then things got even worse when the neighbor recommended a young couple rent the apartment above the landlord's garage. Despite all her paranoia about our visitors, the couple she brought in turned out to be criminals. One night while we were out at dinner, they broke into the landlord's house and stole a phone from the living room. The phone was one I had lended to my landlord. It was my recently deceased mother's phone. I confronted them after confirming the phone was inside their apartment by texting it and hearing the distinctive notification tone. They denied everything. Later, the same couple stole the landlord's car. It was found 4 days later abandoned in a nearby canyon, costing him nearly $3,000 in impound fees. Eventually, I moved out once renovations on the house I had inherited from my mom were finished. The final straw came when the neighbor let her large German shepherd loose just as my 4-year-old son stepped out of my car. The dog ran towards him, barking and growling. The landlord later told me that the neighbor calmed down after I left, even though my boyfriend still lived there. After I moved away for good, life finally went back to normal. Looking back, the only explanation we could come up with was that she had held on to some strange resentment from that awkward Thanksgiving years earlier and blamed her divorce on me. Either way, living next door to her was definitely an experience I'll never forget. This started when I was in kindergarten or first grade. The neighbors who terrorized us lived one house over, and it's important to know that their teenage son, who I will call Jack, was known as a screw-up. He was caught on camera watching our next-door neighbor showering. My parents were friends with our neighbors, so she told my mom. Then my dad's expensive racing bikes got stolen out of our detached garage. My dad saw Jason riding the stolen bike around the neighborhood, so we thought he should just confront his parents and demand the bike back. The father asked Jason right in front of my dad if he took the bike, and Jason said no. Then Jason's father threatened my dad with violence. We called the police, but they were no help. Not too long after that, Jason's dad showed up outside of our house, yelling that he and his friend were going to beat up my dad for yelling at Jason. Not too long after, something horrible happened. We left our pet bunny and guinea pig outside on nice days, and only if someone was home. That day was one of those days. My brother and I got back from going out with our mom and ran to check on them. I can still see what I saw in my head. Our bunny was drowned in our kiddie pool, and the guinea pig had been kicked across the yard into the alley. My mom, brother, and I were all crying hysterically. They were innocent, and only a psychopath would murder helpless animals. Her injuries were so severe that we had to put her to sleep. Jason's dad did this because my dad had yelled at Jason about stealing his bike earlier that week. My mom had enough and confronted the dad, who just laughed. He said they were just animals. My parents called the police, who informed them that they were at the house constantly anyways, and I can't remember if Jason's dad got in trouble. Time passed for a while without any problems from the neighbors, until one night when I was in 2nd grade. I was asleep with my dog named Wrinkles in bed with me, where my bed faces the windows. Suddenly, Wrinkles was going nuts, and I heard a sound coming from near the screen on my open window. Then a loud male whisper which sounded like Jason. He said in more obscene terms that he was going to have relations with me. I jumped out of bed and ran to my parents' room, shaking and crying so hard I couldn't breathe. I told them someone was outside my window. They called the police, who found one of our lounge chairs outside my window, and the screen ripped like someone was trying to get into my room. They also found a shoe print. It was so traumatic and disgusting that a 16-year-old would say that to a 2nd grader. They went to Jason's house, but apparently he wasn't home, and they searched for him but never found him. My parents put up lights all the way around the house after that. A short time later, my mom found a paper plate with rice and a dead crow outside of our back door. Our evil neighbors moved not long after the husband died. His wife had joked about poisoning him before, so we always wonder if that's what ended up happening. The whole thing was extremely messed up, and it all started over a stolen bike. Jason is apparently a cop now, but I really hope that's false. When I moved to my new apartment, everything in my life felt like it was finally working out. I had just been promoted at work after years of grinding. My salary doubled, I bought my first new car, and I was finally leaving my cramped studio for a real apartment. It was a corner unit on the 8th floor with a wide window that looked over the river and the downtown lights. The building looked older from outside, but the apartment itself was great. 2 bedrooms, a decent kitchen, a living room big enough for the couch I had been saving for, and the rent was also lower than anything else I had seen in that area. I signed the lease that same day. The move-in was exhausting, and that night I sat on the couch eating takeout and watching random shows until I passed out. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to noises above me. It sounded like someone stomping on the floor above me. I checked the time, and it was 2:15 a.m. I didn't want to start trouble with my neighbors on the first night, so I ignored it. I put in earbuds and went back to sleep. The next night, the same thing happened, but I figured maybe the people upstairs had just moved in too. But the next night, the same thing happened again. Sometimes I heard what sounded like objects hitting the floor. One night, it sounded like dishes were breaking. Another time, I thought I heard a woman shouting, but the words were muffled and short. It went on every night. By the 6th day in my new apartment, I was barely sleeping. I started coming home from work already stressed, just waiting for it to start again. On Friday night, I got back at around 10:30 p.m. I showered and laid in bed scrolling on my phone. Eventually, the noises started again. That was the moment I decided I was done ignoring it. I put on my shoes and went upstairs. I knocked lightly and then harder a couple times, and stood there for a good 5 minutes waiting for someone to open the door, but nobody came. Confused, I went back down to my apartment, figuring they didn't want to confront me. The next morning was Saturday, and after another long night of noise, I decided I would deal with it once and for all. I grabbed my phone and called the building's front desk. I got no answer though, so I waited a few minutes, threw on my shoes, locked my door, and headed to the stairwell to head down to the main lobby. The stairwell lights were off for some reason, so it was darker than usual. As I started down the stairs, I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow at first, but then they matched my pace. By the time I reached the 6th floor, they sounded closer and were speeding up. I didn't know why, but my chest got tighter and I felt the urge to run down the stairs the rest of the way. As I sped up and ran down the stairs as fast as I could, I heard footsteps behind me accelerating into a run. I ran the rest of the way down and pushed the doors to the lobby. The guard was sitting at the desk, and I told him all about the problems I'd been having with my neighbors upstairs. He looked confused and said that he had only started working there 2 days ago. He didn't know anything about the building yet or the residents, but he mentioned the previous guard had worked there over 10 years and lived a few streets away. He gave me the address. I drove there immediately, and the old guard was very friendly and let me into his place. I explained everything I had been dealing with yet again to the older guard. Eventually, he sighed and told me there used to be a couple living in that unit above me. They argued all the time, and everyone in the building could hear it. He went on to say that one night the husband snapped, and the neighbors heard fighting, things breaking, and someone screaming. The man had killed his wife in that apartment directly above me, and the police took him away that same night. After that, every tenant who moved into the unit below complained about the same noises that I had described. So that had forced me to move out of my dream apartment after only a week, which apparently was the longest anyone had lasted in my unit. My girlfriend and I have been together for a little over 2 years now. Not long after we started dating, she moved into my place. I'd been living there alone for a while, so having someone around felt different at first, but in a good way. The house is small, but the yard is big for the area. When summer came around, we decided to make the most of it. We bought one of those above-ground pools from a hardware store and set it up behind the garage. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was perfect for hot afternoons after work. We started inviting friends over on weekends. Sometimes we'd grill, other times we'd sit around a fire pit built with leftover bricks. One night we had a few people over, just relaxing and having a couple drinks. It was getting late when a man from the house behind ours walked through the alleyway to our yard. I had seen him before but never really talked to him. He introduced himself and started chatting like he had known us for years. He talked about the weather, the neighborhood, and our dog. Then he started asking about the pool. He kept looking at it while he talked. "Looks nice," he said. "Must be good on days like this." My girlfriend and I said yeah, it was nice to cool off after work. Then he said something like, "I wish I had something like that, and I see you two out there all the time." He was probably around 50 or so. We were both in our early 20s. I didn't think much of it at the time. I'm usually pretty easygoing with neighbors, so I told him if he ever wanted to swim, he could just ask us and let us know. A few weeks later, I was still at work one afternoon when my girlfriend called me. She told me she had gotten home early that day. Our driveway curves around the house, so you can't see the backyard from the street. When she walked into the kitchen, she looked out the window above the sink. That window looked straight into the yard, and the neighbor was in our pool, just floating there. She told me she froze for a second because she didn't expect to see anyone back there. I told her to stay inside and I would be home as soon as I could. By the time I got back, he was gone. I was mad. I knew I had told him he could swim sometime, but I meant with permission, not just showing up when nobody was home. So I took the ladder off the pool and put it in the shed so that nobody could use it unless we took the ladder out. Later that evening, I saw the guy outside while walking the dog. I told him he couldn't just come into our yard like that. He apologized and said he thought it was fine because of what I had said before. He promised it wouldn't happen again. For a while, things were quiet. But after that, we started noticing him more often. He would stand in his yard and look towards our house. Sometimes he would be out there when my girlfriend got home from work. Sometimes it was late at night, too. Around that same time, we were talking with some other neighbors down the street, and his name came up. One of them told us something that shocked me. Apparently, the guy had a history. They said he had been in trouble before involving a family member. They didn't know all the details, but they said it was serious. That already made things uncomfortable. Then another neighbor told us something that was even worse. They said the guy had been bragging to another neighbor that he could see inside our house at night. He had been talking about looking at my girlfriend through our windows, to the point where he had binoculars that he could use as well. The way our house is set up, the kitchen and laundry area both have large windows facing the backyard. At the time, we didn't have blinds or curtains there. I had lived alone before and never thought about it. My girlfriend usually changes clothes in the laundry room after work. When I heard that story, I felt my face getting hot and I was furious. I asked our neighbor if they had any extra private property signs because they had some put up around in their yard. They gave me one and a metal stake. I walked straight into our backyard with a hammer and planted the sign right by the fence line. The guy was outside when I did it. I yelled across the yard telling him to stay away from our property and stop watching our house. A couple other neighbors came outside because of the shouting. My girlfriend stayed inside the whole time. After that, I came back in. I taped a blanket over the laundry room window, and I told her we'd buy proper curtains the next day. Later that night, we looked the guy up online. It turned out that the stories were true. Years earlier, he had been arrested for abusing a relative, and he was also a registered offender. Thankfully, about 2 months later, we noticed a moving truck at his place. By the end of the week, he was gone. When I was 19, I rented a small basement unit with my sister and her baby. It was one of those split houses where the landlord lived upstairs and rented out the lower level. The place wasn't great, but it was cheap and close to where I worked. The landlord was a quiet guy in his late 50s. He didn't talk much, but he always seemed to be around. A couple months after we moved in, he told us he needed to bring someone over to check the water heater. While the repair guy was there, I noticed he paid more attention to us than the heater. If I walked from the kitchen to the living room, his eyes would follow. At one point, I caught him standing in the hallway near the bedrooms, even though the heater was in a separate closet. When I asked if he needed help, he just said he was checking pressure and went back. After about an hour, he left, and I didn't really know anything about water heaters, so I couldn't judge his process too much. 2 days later, my sister took her baby to stay overnight at a friend's place, leaving me alone. Around 9 p.m., I heard a knock on the door. It was the same guy who had come to fix the heater 2 days prior. He said he needed to recheck something and that it would only take a minute. I told him it wasn't a good time and he should come back when the landlord was home. He insisted, saying it was urgent and it could cause a leak if not handled right away. Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. I kept the door mostly closed and told him to come back the next day. That's when he put his hand in the door and tried to push it open, not hard yet, but softly I guess, trying to coerce his way into my place. He smiled, but it didn't match what he was doing. I told him to leave, but instead of answering, he looked past me into the apartment and took another step forward. I pushed the door shut harder and told him to leave. Right before I closed it completely, I saw movement near the side of the entrance where the wall jutted out just enough to block part of the view. My landlord was standing there, pressed flat against the wall, just out of sight from the doorway. I slammed the door, locked it, and didn't move for a while. I could hear low voices outside for a few seconds, then footsteps going up the stairs. I didn't sleep well that night and even barricaded the door with some furniture. The next morning, I told my sister everything. We packed our stuff that same day and left. We didn't tell the landlord we were going until after we were gone. The landlord and the repair guy, who I'm assuming was his buddy, definitely could have forced their way into my apartment because I almost believed the repair guy at first. However, I'm glad that I ended up being safe that night. I contacted the police about it, but I have no idea if anything ever happened with my report. This happened to me on January 17th, 2026. The neighbors were fighting next door. I heard the loud yelling and thumping from the weak walls of the apartment. At this time, I was in the kitchen preparing meals and getting ready to receive some packages. Then, out of nowhere, someone started to knock at my front door. It started out normal, but quickly started getting louder and more demanding. I went to look through my peephole and saw that there was a lady there. Her huge eyes were looking back at me. I stepped back and I asked what she wanted. She started asking for a phone and whining. The lady really wanted me to open the door, but I didn't want to. She started to shake the doorknob violently and then began pushing and clawing at the door. I walked away. The lady that lives with me also went to check through the door from the noise. She was actually considering opening the door to that crazed woman. I kept telling her not to, and I was even so scared that I weaponed up. If she comes in, we're all going out together, was the only thing going through my mind in that moment. We didn't open the door though. Instead, we kept asking what the lady wanted and telling her to go away. But she did not. Here's some audio I recorded of the event. Then, just like it happened, it just stopped. She moved away from the door and just left. Lucky for us, that crazy lady moved on, but we're still reeling from what happened. Back when I was a kid, we moved into this new house when I was about 8 years old. We only lived there for about 3 or 4 years, and we moved around a few times for my dad's job. But I remember this place pretty well, and there was something kind of creepy that happened when we lived there. So the house was in a pretty quiet neighborhood. However, there were a lot of houses there, as it was a pretty typical neighborhood of many streets with a good amount of houses on them all next to each other. The houses were not all the same size though, as most of them looked different from each other. Some were larger or smaller than others, but for the most part it was a middle-class area. I remember that our house had a decent-sized front yard and a good-sized driveway as well. So I would go outside all the time. I didn't know many of the neighbors on our street, but I remember that there was this house that was behind the one across the street from us and one over to the right. This house was always visible because it was 3 stories tall, so it kind of towered over the others. So at some point, I don't recall exactly when, I started noticing something from this tall house. When I would be outside, I would often see someone in one of the top windows of the house, seemingly watching me with binoculars. It appeared to be a woman, but I couldn't tell many details about her at all. It was really far away, but it always looked like she was watching me. For some reason, at first, it didn't seem to bother me too much. And then I didn't know if she was really watching me or maybe something else nearby, like maybe she was bird watching. I was too far to tell exactly what she was looking at, but it often appeared as though she was looking right at me. It wouldn't happen every time I was outside, but it would happen quite often, and she would do almost the same thing every time. She would just be there in the window with binoculars, staring right at me seemingly. When I looked over at her, she wouldn't move or anything. In fact, she would barely move at all. And I never saw anybody else at that window either. It was really weird. And after it happened at least like 10 different times, it kind of creeped me out. One time when she was watching me, I was confused by it like always. So for some reason on this occasion, I decided to wave up at her. This time when I did, she did not wave back at me, but actually moved away and out of view. That was the only unusual thing I remember through most of it. Being a kid though, I would just continue to go outside and hang out there. I really had no idea who she was, and I didn't tell anybody about it either. Then I remember that after probably months of this, I went outside one time at night. I don't remember why I was outside or exactly how late it was, but I know that it was completely dark out. As I was outside there in the driveway or front yard area, I remember noticing the neighbor watching me from the window again. For some reason, it felt creepier at night. But then, as I was watching her watch me, she moved away from the window and was quickly out of view. I didn't think too much of it. In fact, I was obviously glad that she was gone. So I stayed outside, and then I remember like 2 or 3 minutes later, I heard a car start to drive down our street from the end. Our street was really quiet, especially at night, so I looked over to see. I didn't recognize the car, but it was driving really slow. Surprisingly though, I noticed the car slowing down and then parking on the side of the road just about across from our house on the other side of the street. It was not exactly in front of our house and slightly closer to the neighbors, but it was close enough. When I looked to the driver's window though, at first I couldn't see well enough. But then I noticed it appeared to be the same woman who would watch me from the window. This had never happened before. She parked the car but did not get out. and she appeared to be looking at me again. I was so creeped out that I ran inside and then covered all the windows. When I looked out of a front window maybe 10 minutes later, she was gone. After that, I didn't go outside for a while, especially not at night. However, when I returned to going outside again, maybe a few weeks later, I didn't see her anymore. I never noticed her watching me from her window again, and I never saw her car either. I'm not sure what was going on there, but it was really strange. Maybe she moved, maybe she just decided to stop spying on me, but we didn't live in that house for too long, as I said. I don't know if she still lives there or not, but I randomly remember that, and I wonder what the deal was. I live with my husband in a house that we've had for a few years now. Last year, something crazy occurred. We know some of the neighbors, but not everyone. Some I will just recognize, and others I've actually talked to and are friends with. People around here seem nice, and we've never had any problems with anyone. Generally, nothing crazy has happened here, and things will usually be pretty calm and quiet. For a little more background, I work a job where I get there early and generally am back home by 3 p.m. and sometimes 2. My husband will arrive home at a more normal time of around 5 or so, and we both work on weekdays. So one day, after I got back from work, my cell phone rang from a number that I didn't recognize, but it had a local area code. I answered it out of curiosity. It was a woman on the other end who I didn't recognize by her voice, but she sounded friendly. She said that she was my neighbor from down the street, and she had got my number from another neighbor. She then asked me if her son could stay at my house when he got home the following day. The reason was because she would be gone for work, and she just wanted me to have him stay here until she was back. Without really giving it much thought, I said sure, it would not be a problem. Now, I was wondering some things in my head, but I didn't ask them because I didn't want to seem rude. Like, for example, why did she ask me? I was fairly confident that I had never met this lady before, and I didn't even know exactly what house she lived in. Why would she trust me with her son when we had never met? But really, I assumed that she probably had spoken to the neighbors, and they had vouched for me. How did she know I would be home at that time also? Again, I thought probably the neighbors told her. I wasn't sure though, but I had talked about my job and other stuff to some neighbors. So I wasn't being suspicious or anything, and really I was just confused. I thought maybe the lady was new to the neighborhood and didn't really know anyone, and maybe the other neighbors weren't able to watch her kid first. I didn't mind watching her son, and I'm pretty good with kids and have watched friends' children in the past. So she told me that her son would come over at about 3 o'clock the following day, and when she got back from work, she could pick him up. I said okay, and we left it at that. I figured it would be easy, and he could just sit in the living room for a couple hours and watch TV or something. I told my husband about it when he got back, and he was just like, cool. So the next day, after I got back from work, there was no call or anything from the neighbor, but I luckily remembered. Shortly after 3 p.m., there was a knock at the front door. I went over and opened it, and was shocked at what I saw. There was no child there, but a tall, skinny-looking grown man standing outside my front door. He was young, looked to be early 20s, but he was definitely an adult nonetheless. When I opened the door, he smelled of cigarettes and alcohol. He had an overall dirty appearance. I was shocked. He then opened the door further and just walked right in with a backpack over his shoulder, saying a casual, "Hey, what's up?" After a moment, I said, "Who are you?" He said, "Didn't my mom tell you that I was coming over?" I said, "Yeah, but I thought you were like 7 or 8 years old." He said no, he was 25. What he said next shocked me even more. He said, "Yeah, I just need a place to stay until my mom comes back from her work trip in a few days." I was thinking, what? A few days? I asked him what he meant, and he told me that he would be staying here, and he asked where he would sleep. I told him I thought there was a misunderstanding, and not only did I think he was a young child, but I thought he would only be staying here for a few hours. His mom said nothing about it. I told him that we didn't have any space for him to stay the night. He started talking about how he didn't have anywhere to go, and how his girlfriend had kicked him out and stuff. I asked him why he can't stay at his mom's place without her being there, and he said that she had kicked him out too, and it was complicated. I didn't want to get into his family drama, and maybe he was going through a rough patch, but it wasn't fair for him to be dumped on me like this. I told him I was sorry, but he had to go. This is where his attitude seemed to change. He got slightly angry and said no, he was staying here, because I said he could. I told him once again to leave. That's when he said no once more, and he walked farther into the house. He went upstairs, almost running. I went after him, but when I got up there, he had run into our bedroom and shut the door and locked it behind him. I tried to get him to come out, but he was ignoring me. So then I called my husband and told him of the situation. He said he was on his way home. Then I tried reasoning with the guy, but he was completely ignoring me. I threatened to call the police, but that didn't seem to have an effect on him. I was seriously going to call the cops, but decided to wait until my husband got back. I then attempted to call the guy's mom, but when I did, the number appeared to have blocked me, because the calls would not go through. I went downstairs and just hoped that the guy wasn't going to steal or damage anything. My husband arrived home a short time later, and the guy was still up there. My husband went upstairs and started banging on the door and threatening to beat the guy up and stuff. After like 5 minutes of this, it finally got him to leave. He left the bedroom and ran down the stairs, practically being chased by my husband. He left and sprinted away down the street. We looked and nothing was stolen or messed up, thankfully. After that, I tried to figure out if they really lived on our street or not. I asked a few neighbors, but none of them said they gave my number to anyone else. So I really don't know who this woman was or how she got my number. I think maybe she did live down the street, or at least in the area, because I know there are a lot of houses on the block. And also, she had to have known what time I get home every day, and I think that she might have been watching me. But it remains a bit of a mystery. I'm certainly going to ask more questions next time someone asks me to watch their kid. I live in what I've always considered to be a quiet and safe neighborhood. Nothing much seems to happen here. The houses are slightly spread out, and it's not quite out in the country, but not that close to the city either. I know most of the neighbors, and I'm friends with a good amount of them. A few years ago, I was at home with my wife, and it got to be late. The weather was nice, and I had been doing a little bit of work out in the garage. Nothing that crazy, just messing around with some old junk. I left the door open because I had many times before, and nothing had ever happened. When I was inside and it was getting pretty late, like after 10 p.m., I heard my wife say something. She said that it looked like Jeff was coming over. He's a neighbor that lived a short ways down the street. I knew him decently well, and I had talked to him many times before. Occasionally, we would stop by each other's places if we saw each other outside working on something or something like that. I went over to the window and wondered why he would be coming over so late at night. I watched Jeff walk up the driveway, but instead of going and turning to go to the front door, he went straight. This led him straight towards the garage and out of my sight. I thought that he must have been thinking I was still in the garage, so I went to get my shoes on and go outside. Within probably a minute, I left the house. I walked over to the garage, but when I got there, Jeff was gone. He was not in the garage and was nowhere in sight. I called out but got no response. It was so strange because I knew that I had just seen him walk up my driveway. I went in the backyard and then went back to the front, and he just wasn't there. But then, after going back in the garage, I noticed something. A few of my things were gone. Could Jeff have stolen them? Nothing else made any sense. I went back inside and told my wife about the crazy situation. She didn't know what to make of it. I decided to go over and talk to Jeff the following day. So the next day, I went to his house and knocked on the door, but he did not answer. I was a little suspicious, but maybe he just wasn't home. After that, though, I was always sure to close my garage. So sometime, maybe a week later or so, I happened to notice Jeff outside. I walked up and approached him, and he seemed normal at first. I told him how I saw him walking up my driveway the other night, but he completely denied it. I told him he took my stuff, but he denied that too. He said that he thought I must be joking. To be nice, I said I must be mistaken then, and then I left. I didn't want to get into a big argument with my neighbor. I didn't think it was worth it. The stuff that he stolen was valuable, but not that valuable. I wasn't that desperate to get it back. So I went back home, and since then, we haven't spoken. I know he took my stuff. I think he saw the garage door open, thought that I had gone to bed, and simply walked in and took it. But to be safe and avoid being seen, he left the garage through the back door and then cut through my neighbor's yard to go back home. It's pretty crazy how he did that. I'm hoping that nothing more like that happens, but I'm going to be careful around him. I live by myself in an apartment. When I first moved in here, I got a rude awakening, literally. It was probably like my second or third week living here. I have a small one-bedroom apartment in a pretty decent building, and my place is on the second floor. It's a nice place overall, not a dump by any means, and most of the people seem nice. At the time, I didn't know any of my neighbors immediately around me though. So after a short time there, one night I was awoken to the sound of someone knocking loudly at my front door. I got up and out of bed, seeing that it was after midnight, and I went to see who was there. The knocking stopped by the time I arrived at the door though. When I looked through the peephole, nobody was there. It was strange. I was kind of creeped out by this odd event. Why would anybody come to my door so late? By the next day though, I had mostly forgot about it. However, a few nights later, the same thing happened again, except this time I was still awake. It was late at night, and I heard a knocking on the door. I got up and went to the peephole and saw this woman knocking. I didn't know what she wanted, so I went to open the door. I unlocked it first. However, as soon as I started to do this, I heard her take off running. By the time the door was open and I looked into the hallway, I saw her entering an apartment door just down the hall and across it. So she was my neighbor. I didn't know why she was seemingly pranking me like this. I went back in and was confused, but there was no more knocking that night. The very next night, though, she came back and knocked at my door again at around the same time, and once more ran away. It was pretty annoying, to be honest. I didn't know if she was pranking me or what. Maybe she was serious, maybe she wanted something, but every time I went to the door she would just run away. I let it go this time. However, the very next night she did it again, and I had it. I went to the door really fast, but she was already gone by then. So I walked over there and I knocked on her door. She didn't answer or do anything, so I knocked again, this time louder. When I did, I heard her yell really loud from the other side of the door. It was like she was right there on the other side, but I hadn't heard her walking over to the door. She told me to go away and stop bothering her so late at night. She sounded seriously angry. I could not believe her nerve. It was like she was acting like I was the one banging on her door all the time. I yelled that she was the one who kept knocking on my door, and I told her to stop. She interrupted me and yelled really loud for me to go away or she would call the cops. I was furious. I told her to do it, and then I banged on her door really loud one last time. Then I walked back to my apartment. The cops never came. But after that, she never knocked on my door late at night again either. I still live here. I don't think she lives there anymore though. I never saw her again around the building or anything. I haven't seen anyone coming or going from that apartment. However, I'm hoping that she does not currently still live here.